Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ISCM Townhall on forecasting and demand planning. This is the fourth in the series of town halls that we have conducted for the Middle East. The first one primarily was on larger supply chain planning and supply disruption. We followed it by another one where we looked at, how demand planning function is important during the COVID, but that was very, very limited to those periods. And we looked at the trends, strategies, firefighting, and other approaches to managing pandemics. And it was an interesting debate from the demand planners across the UAE region. Then the third one was largely on the supply chain strategy, which encompassed distribution, warehousing, logistics, and larger integration with the supply chain. And we did talk about autonomous planning and connected planning as a part of really streamlining this organization. Now, this is the fourth town hall series, which we thought will deep dive into two prominent aspects of demand planning. One, forecasting. Two, planning itself, not only in demand planning, but its role in planning as such. And hence, we will look at pre-pandemic approaches during the pandemic and lockdowns, and what it holds for future. We will look at forecasting, demand planning, and various approaches to demand planning, where the participants are requested to bring in anything that they deem suited for discussion here. Maybe it is DDMRP, maybe it is SNOP, maybe it is IBP, or maybe it is technology-driven connected planning with the use of analytics, machine language, and artificial intelligence. So that's the focus of the whole debate that we have. And I'm happy to have such a great panel and young panel looking at forecasting, demand planning, and IPP in their organization. COVID-19 has created roadblocks to the businesses as usual mode. I'm not going to get into the dynamics and statistics and history of COVID now, because it has been repeated lament now. But businesses need to wake up to a new reality, one where the past is no indication of the future, one where demand shifts and supply disruptions are rewriting the rules of the game. The whole moot question is that then how do we plan for our supply chains? The old approaches of deterministic planning is giving way to a resilient frameworks. People, large number of people, especially a group which is very prominent, is getting a larger acceptance in planning called demand-driven MRP approaches, is saying that RIP forecasting, that means forecasting is dead. There are groups which have brought about a very strong process into the understanding of organizational supply chain, landscape, and building on those landscape along with the organizational design and architecture has been able to guide companies to a better planning and better direction and better profitability and customer service. With pandemic, things have changed. There's a lot of chaos everywhere. And hence, my first question that I'm going to ask is a pre-pandemic. And the first question is to Sandeep. Sandeep, what has been the approaches that companies have followed in the pre-pandemic period?
Good morning everybody. Good morning, doctor, and good morning to all the attendees. So pre-pandemic, different organizations follow different models or planning strategies, whether it is demand-driven or SNOP or IBP. So for us, we have been following a customized in-house tool, which is for sales and operational planning, which is more on a 12-month planning horizon. And it is the normal baseline that we have, after taking into account the outliers and getting to a baseline, which is shared across the organization in the SNOP forum with all our stakeholders like marketing, sales, finance, and also our customers. So we get into a collaborative planning and forecasting kind of a consensus meeting. And that's how we have been able to drive the planning for us.
Thank you, Sandeep. I think that that sums up the approaches that a lot of companies in the world have been following, called as SNOP, which is based largely on uh, baseline forecast with 12-month horizon, saying that it's an aggregate demand. And this is where a lot of criticism of SNOP has happened during the pandemic period.
Correct.
Moving forward to Radha Raman Jha, he comes from retail with a huge background in retail. And if you really look at forecasting in retail, which is a fast changing, volatile landscape with life cycle becoming shorter and shorter every day, what has been the approaches and forecasting approaches that companies, retail companies in UAE markets have actually adopted in the past before the pandemic? How have been planning done along with the forecasting as a basis?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me in this panel. It's really a great thing to discuss about this thing, because in the current situation, I believe that many organizations have really understood the real importance of planning, which has taken the back seat in many industry, including retail as well. So I think it's very important first to understand the impact and why retail is slightly different than other businesses, and mainly the non-food retail. If you see, the non-food retail is the one which have worstly affected in this entire pandemic, and this is same have been highlighted by Harvard Business School, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and everybody, and which is truly obvious as well. And the reason for that is, if you see, we have in any fashion retail we have more than 30,000 SKU in one season, and we have 3 to 4 season. So we are essentially looking at 1 million plus SKU to do any kind of forecasting and all that. And you can imagine that the data have always been, even without this pandemic, have been always being uncertain, because when you're talking about one style, one shirt, you don't sell more than 3 or 4 pieces in a week. So even if you talk about the weekly forecast, or maybe at the monthly level forecast, your data have always been unreliable. And also that it's very important to understand that for us fashion retailer, none of the real deterministic model works. So you take any example of Halls, Winter, Croston, or any of the other forecasting method, they have never be applied to us, and they have never be efficient result driver for us, because we fashion industry is mainly driven by many external factors, and none of these models generally take into account all this thing. But one of the main good thing for us is that we have ample amount of data. The reason being, now I mean, you would imagine that apparently we have captured double the data that we have captured before 2010 till the time this world had started. So we have huge amount of data. The only issue that we have currently is to harness this data and use this data in such a way that we use this effectively. For example, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, all non-food retailers are into the e-com. So right, even if we don't have footfall in the store, but we know who is visiting our site, who is looking at which item, which product, at what time, at what price. So we have all this information, which are really a kind of demand signal. They are not a true representation of the direct demand signal, but yes, they are giving a kind of demand signal that we can use to effectively use all this data crunching, data analytics, and use it for the real predictive analytics, instead of merely using the normal forecasting that we have that we just talked about.
All right. I think thank you, Radha, for this particular introduction. But I have another question that really needs to be taken into account, is that when you look at fashion trends factors or external variables, there are so many external variables, including the trends in fashion across the globe, that affect uh, your demand affects your overall supply chain planning, and hence how do you deal with such a volatility? Because it's
It's a
good,
very
the
good.
data contains that volatility, but how do you deal with this volatility? What is the planning processes for dealing with this volatility? Not necessarily the pandemic. Pre-pandemic volatility also is very high in the fashion and the beauty retail as you represent.
Absolutely, Dr. Rakesh, and you have, rightly pointed out the real pain point in the retail business. Because if you see, in fashion, I mean, this is what I generally tell all my, demand planner, that a good demand planner is one who expect unexpected things. So, you should be able to expect and you should be able to understand all those unexpected things. Then you are a real demand planner in the fashion business. And yes, you have rightly said that, we have many factors. We have internal factor, we have external factor, and even in this factor we have structure factor, we have unstructured factor, and so on. So what we back to your question, what we do and what many non-food retailers do is have a two level of the planning. One at the aggregate level, which which is more efficient at the long term, because you cannot plan at a SKU level. That is for sure in the fashion business. You have to go at very very aggregate level. But even those aggregate level forecast doesn't give you a good kind of accuracy. So what we do generally is we essentially do three or four level of different forecasting, looking at aggregate level to a mid level to a lowest level, and then we have multiple SNOP meeting to reconcile and come to a common consensus which will be used. And this is, I mean, I I would just like to point out one more thing, that many fashion retailers in this region, they don't have any kind of manufacturing. So we don't own any kind of manufacturing. We are mainly buy from China. And this pandemic having such a worse affected than other pandemic, because we have been primarily dependent on the Chinese manufacturing industry. If you see, in 2002 to 2004, when we have SARS pandemic, it was not the case that we were not dependent, but that time China was just 4 to 5% of the entire manufacturing and GDP of the world. But now it's 16 to 17%, which means that essentially it's not just about Middle East, but globally all the fashion trade have been affected. And how do we do that? Is again we look at
Nada, I will come back to this in the second phase of the discussion, the impact of
yeah.
pandemic and China. Let me go to Jan. Jan, can you explain the way Henkel actually, or similar industries, the industry trends in terms of demand planning that existed before, and how were you planning your demand? How were you planning your supplies?
Thank you, Rakesh. I mean, main thing, we are mostly trying to automate things because it's just getting more and more complicated. And we are trying to make a tailor-made solution for each market and country. So we started to differentiate more and more from region to region and from country to country. The main thing that we are focusing now to roll out demand sensing across all applicable countries to reduce the workload on the demand planners, to take more customer data into picture. And for our key countries like Turkey, Israel, Tunisia, etc., we aim to make such changes. It's already rolled out across all other Europe and North American markets. I mean, with this, we have seen significant improvement in terms of forecast accuracy. That's the one thing. The second thing is we are trying to increase transparency across all information flows. Therefore, we are introducing more and more Power BI tools to make it visible to anyone to jump in, check, and at least benchmark across countries and regions to then utilize the learnings. I mean, in the past, we used to store more goods in the warehouses. Now this we are continuously reducing to minimize risk, and we are switching day by day to a model directly from plant to customer for all applicable sizes. Then, I mean, also In terms of SNOP, I mean, we used to have, I mean, let's say on a monthly cycle at a more overview level. Now we are going into more and more detail into the countries to that extent that we start to have SNOPs directly with the customer side for all our big markets. And I mean, we are kind of acting like business partners and having SNOP with the customer himself, and where we have both the commercial teams and the supply chain team of the customer. And in the parallel, I mean, we are trying to switch from more SNOP to IBP. And for this, right now, we are conducting a survey across the whole company, including all the GMs, sales side, marketing side, etc., for their inputs. I mean, to make the shift to a more comprehensive approach with IBP. I guess these are the main actions that we are doing for the time being.
Hassan, you have been working in the pharmaceutical specialty. Can you tell us the approach that is followed before the pandemic in terms of demand planning?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so in terms, the pharma industry is more into seasonal demand, especially in this region. You have like Hajj season, you have the winter season, spring, where you have allergies, and it's different reactions of the community in terms of the demand, what kind of medication is needed. So it was more in a way adjusted to meet that seasonal demand, where a typical S&OP meeting model was held between all the stakeholders, which are basically the internal stakeholders. You have the commercial teams, you have the marketing teams, regulatory teams, supply chain teams. All of these, they have the regular S&OP meeting that starts with the normal demand review, where we have detailed meetings with each of the team members, try to assess the in-market demand. Then we go into another phase and check the feasibility of whether this demand is, we can supply it. We have to change it into a to-market plan. Is it executable or no? Because there are supply limitations that we have to take into consideration. And then we go into the assessment, internal assessment, with the management, and the execution and communication with our partners. That was more of a standard approach. I believe this is the approach that all the industry follows. Nevertheless, in recent times, this approach has been more agile. It has been subject to more frequent changes. The demand is no more predictable like before. Your market, which is in our case, it is the hospitals. During the pandemic, hospitals were not functioning as usual. Now, what does this mean? It doesn't mean that people will not take their medication. They will. It doesn't mean that the consumption of the medication will stop, but it is depleting. Sorry. Yeah, it is actually depleting the stocks that are available in the market. Now, what will happen? We have to expect that the demand, that once business comes back to normal, there will be more demand just to cover the market needs and replenish the stocks. So it is different. It's no more that, okay, the order will follow the same pattern. We have to be ready to expect a change in the phasing, a change in our forecasts that we have submitted already to our suppliers to produce on. This puts a bigger challenge on us. Yeah.
Thank you, Hassan, for this bringing the basic nature of seasonality and other functionality in the forecasting and also in the SNOP. I think there is a larger consensus that exists here saying that every company goes through this basic data collections, then either they share information, whatever the kind of information they are, they go through an SNOP process. Hannah, what has been the approach to manage demand and supply in your terms and the places where you work? What have been the basic approaches and how has this approach changed during the pandemic? So I would like you to start looking at the pandemic and start talking about the change in approach, because otherwise it's getting a little repetitive.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Actually, there have been lots of talks about S&OP, and I will evolve this S&OP into IBP, which is Integrated Business Planning. S&OP works very well when we have, a certain location where all the entities are available there, like production, distribution, and the market as well. But when we try to manage the demand and supply across a large region with different countries and different models, I think we really need to move into IBP. So that the normal progress is we start with S&OP, building the basic elements of demand, supply, finance input, and the right discussions across the board, which usually done inside the country, and then to integrate it with the whole globe. If you have international, if you're working in an international company, then you will need to evolve it into integrated business planning. When we talk about demand planning specifically, and then I'll move to supply, working in a food industry, there are lots of challenges of short shelf lives of the products, which means we need to be reactive mode and we need to understand the demand well in advance and proactively predict, as one of the colleagues mentioned, the unexpected. Because if we are not ready before the signal happens, then we will miss the opportunity. The competition will take it. This is one of the complexities in the food industry. The other complexity is seasonality, which is very, very high when we talk about Ramadan season, winter, summer, and all of that. Another complexity is international sourcing. So usually in the multinational companies, the plants are scattered across the globe and with different lead times, with different variabilities, and lots of complexities across the markets with different market dynamics as well. That's all add complexity to the supply chain, which puts more pressure in demand to be better and more accurate and required to be as better as possible. When we go to demand is not only demand planner, and we will never have the right demand signal by having the perfect demand planner. Actually, demand needs the whole team. You need commercial, you need sales, you need marketing, and you need to educate them the need of why do we need a better signal in demand. It is not a sales target anymore. It's a demand plan. And that is where it is part of the integrated business planning process. So I think the education for these teams are very, very important, and start with the basics and then go to the complex, which is, complex statistical model or AI and so on. So first of all, we need to understand what are our demand drivers, and either they are internal or external, controllable or uncontrollable. and understand how can we collect this from the market, either through agencies or through our teams to go and collect through systems and so on, and then build the infrastructure, which is the right software, because definitely when we talk about any multinational organization, you will find the number of SKUs are very, very high, more than 1,000 SKUs, sometimes 4,000 SKUs, depends. And that definitely need a system. This cannot be done manually. We have to ensure that the data is available, definitely, by market. And based on all of this, simulate all of these inputs into the normal flow. This is what the basic requirements to establish the right demand signal into the integrated business planning process. It takes time. It takes usually it takes from 6 months to 1 year to just build this culture and be able to have the right conversation in the organization if you are starting it from scratch. Once you reach this degree, then we have to understand the data and start to build our complex models based on that to be better in predictability and forecasting. When we say, for example, baseline forecasting, building blocks, price elasticity, market share, market dynamics, competition, all of these impacts, which are the demand drivers of the signal. Then, of course, definitely after that is the supply part. Yeah.
I think we'll come back to you in the subsequent discussion later.
Okay. When we talk about the epidemic, yeah.
No, I'll come back to you. Let me go back to others and then come back to you. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I think Hannah has brought about a very interesting twist to forecasting. She said the baseline forecast, which is essentially a very strong demand review that happens in integrated business planning, with taking into account internal and external factors and also on the various trends in terms of how the macroeconomy is actually behaving. Now, this takes us to the second question, that companies across the globe have built up their own policies, approaches towards managing demand and hence managing larger supply chain as an integrated lot, where a role of demand planner, as Hannah said, is very significant. He needs to be trained and he's the driver of organizational planning rather than just demand planning or forecasting. During the pandemic, though, as Radha said, there are problems with China or any other market, because if you look at UAE source from all over the world. It's a very dynamic sourcing hub rather than just depending on China. China may have a larger share in some extent, but I think the sourcing portfolio is very, very diversified as the composition of its nationalities in UAE. Not only did supply disruption happens because of this particular composition, there was also a huge amount of demand shift. Maybe one element of people said demand shift was that you blocked the demand. Due to lockdown, you stopped the demand. So that was one way of looking at it. But over the period of time, what you have seen is that such a good entertainment hub, a tourist place, and a global trading place, which interacts with almost all the countries in the world in terms of its business, would have been affected as the COVID started spreading its tentacle to 198, 199 countries in the world, leading to huge demand shift in the negative side, and also causing a long-term, almost a year or 2 years downturn in the macroeconomy and GDP, as someone articulated very well. But those long-term raises few very important questions in the process of debating. What happened post-lockdown? How did we manage this? How do we see the short run when the world economy has started opening up? Livelihoods have become important in terms of, and the life has also become important and livelihoods. So there is quite a trade-off between these things. And how would IBP or SNOP or DDMRP or any other approaches or forecasting-based planning would really evolve in future? So the first question that I would take now is to Radha. saying that retail is a very interesting business. It's not like FMCGs, but yes, there's a disclaimer there. It is dependent on a manufacturing because that's a backbone or whatever form of it. It is an integrated, elongated value chain that makes it a part of the larger supply chain of other companies. How was retail disrupted, and how was planning disrupted, and how was planning remanaged during the pandemic period?
It's a very interesting question, Dr. Rakesh. I wouldn't say that planning was disrupted. I would say that planning was overburdened, because earlier when your sales goes up and everything is smoother, people don't pay attention on what is your current forecast accuracy, how your business would perform. But when things get really bad and ugly, that's where you start looking at your planner, saying that tell me what's going to happen next week, next month, and so on. So that's a kind of first aspect. Second aspect, if you see from the fashion and the retail perspective, and mainly the non-food, because in food industry it has been stable or it's growing, but in the non-food industry and mainly in the fashion industry, our demand and entire pattern have toggled between different channels. When I say channel, if you see it between online versus offline, so it have shifted multiple times and toggle around. So now for us it's a very difficult to really understand how the entire business is gonna unfold in next couple of quarter and in next year as well. Having said that, when we look at the real data, we have realized that some of the business which we have been thinking that brick and mortar is the future have shifted unexpected to the online channel, and some of the business have is not really performing good. So from that perspective, for us it's always a challenge, and it's going to be an ongoing challenge to manage how we do that. In terms of how we really manage this current situation is currently, and in all fashion industry we have multiple forecasting instead of just single forecasting. We have scenario planning with different confidence level, and we present that because, to be very frank, nobody knows that what's going to happen. So how my particular brand, particular class, subclass going to perform in next 2-3 months. So what we do is we use all this kind of scenario planning with different probability, saying that okay, if this would happen with this situation, this is going to happen, and then we use all these different scenario planning into our overall entire SNOP cycle and the entire business scenario to come with a kind of saying that okay, let's try this and let's see what will happen. And this is how we have to live with it for next couple of months until everything gets stabilized, and then we go into a normal demand planning and forecasting. I hope I answered your question.
Radha. I think I see that volatility and uncertainty forces people to see the scenarios, confidence level or no confidence level. I think that's a misnomer. Scenarios are built, and there are so many alternative scenarios, and you look at the scenario which is emerging better, and you do iterative processes to correct scenarios. I think in the same light, I would ask Sandeep. Sandeep, you are into food distribution. You have retail as a business, as one of the part of servicing wholesale and retail. What kind of challenges that you faced during the pandemic, and how did you manage those challenges?
Well, I mean, as Rad mentioned, we have all been affected in this region by the pandemic, and it's no different for us. Starting from port authorities, shortage of containers, delay in courier services, getting allocation, lead times already being longer than the normal lead times that we already have, because some of the products come half the way across the world. So there have been a lot of challenges, and as Rad put it, I would like to second that it was not disruption but overload on the planners and the planning cycle. So as I mentioned, we have a SNOP process, and it is mostly on a monthly kind of a cycle. But with this pandemic, what has happened is we've been forced to look at shorter review meetings, whether it's weekly or sometimes daily. So because the demand signals have been shifting very rapidly, and we had to do segmentation of our products, focus on our core products, do regular meetings, coordinate very closely with our suppliers and sometimes with the supplier, because though we have some products being sourced locally, they have their sourcing points outside the country. So in this situation, even though it's a local supplier, we cannot take it for granted that we'll have the product in-house at the time we need it. So also this calls for planning various scenarios where we need to look at options where if we don't get a core product in-house at the time we want because of this delay and the situation that we have on hand, what is the worst case scenario? So for most of our core products, we have done this worst case scenario planning, that what is the worst that can happen, and we have tried to plan around that and build options around that. And that has been one of the very important and significant factors that has helped us tide over these difficult times.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go to Hannah here. Hannah, what has been the approach that you all have adopted? Because IBP with a horizon of 18 months is a long-term planning, but how do you tackle such plans which requires single minutes, intervention in the planning processes?
Well, actually, at the beginning, we wished if the IBP can be run daily, because every hour there was new news, and because of the challenges which all the colleagues mentioned regarding the demand, and in addition to that, the cash flow in the whole market, which makes barrier on the our distributors and customers as well. So all of this actually was an hourly update. Borders closed, lockdown, and all of this. And because, as I mentioned, it's short shelf life, so we are trying to manage the waste impact out of this epidemic, right? So trying to minimize the write-off risk, which will cause a huge cost impact on all of us and our partners. So this is where the challenge and the complexity came. So actually, IBP by process, it is months 3 onward, even S&OP. In the short term, there is another process which we call it demand control. Some others, they call it short-term process and so on. This process, which is a 12 weeks process, it is a weekly one, which we discuss either depends on the market and the industry, either daily or weekly sales, SQ, and weekly sales signal. Very, very detailed one, and it runs on weekly basis. To be honest, many companies, they discuss the short term in the long term during discussions of IBP. But during the epidemic, the importance of this short term process was very, very, very crucial. And we all shifted into how to improve this one, because we needed a weekly demand supply connections, as I mentioned, to ensure that we have, the updated visibility from the market, and at the same time ensure that we don't overproduce and improve or reduce the risk of the stock write-off. So I think this process was very, very crucial in this epidemic, and all the markets focused on how to improve this. So it was a weekly connect. All the parties discuss together what is the updated signal and what is the situation from supply, and reflected automatically with, of course, complete visibility between the parties. And that helped us to take quick decisions and to be agile and responsive as much as possible to manage, the situation during the epidemic.
Thank you, Anna. Jan, a similar question to you. You have been talking about information flow. How have you used the information flow during the pandemic in order to align your supply chain and plan and manage disruptions?
I mean, we have made mostly use of working from home. I mean, now we can have meetings all of a sudden, and many people can attend more easily. we basically increase the frequency of meetings, and which are always short-term meetings ad hoc with several parties involved. Then several functions, for instance, purchasing, become much more important in the as our main impact was either on the consumer behavior side. As the consumer spend went down, I mean, we started to have the cash flow issue in the market, which Han also mentioned, which indirectly impacted our customers buying. And the second issue is always with the suppliers. I mean, purchasing teams started to get more involved in the game, and we started to see their strengths and coming with alternative suppliers and different production site options, etc. Therefore, we started to have regular updates about all these changes from purchasing side. And I mean, I just don't want to repeat the same things. Therefore, in terms of additional, for instance, in the past, we used to have some updates on a weekly level with commercial teams. Now we are having the daily status update meetings. I mean, the content of our meetings switched from mostly analysis and improvement to status update and solution finding, because more or less every day we are having a different rules for the game. I mean, that's the summary.
Thank you. Hassan, I think you are from the pharmaceutical. You said a disruption in terms of hospitals. There could be also increase in demand for health services in general. So what was the approach that was followed?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues on most of the points that they have mentioned, actually. And as Jan mentioned, we have been dealing with a faster cycle of assessment for the changes. Now, from healthcare industry, the healthcare industry basically is the pandemic has put the healthcare industry in a different category, because it was one of the industries that had more pressure on, was more pressurized during that pandemic because of the nature of the pandemic. It was a health, it was health related. You know, the COVID-19 is a health, serious health related pandemic. So the health industry or the pharmaceutical industry was put under scrutiny mainly by the governments. So it was given priority. So when there was a decision to let sectors work, it was given to pharmacies. When there was a decision for flights to carry cargo, it was to pharmaceuticals first. So we had an advantage, we can say, and this helped us. We capitalized on this advantage that we got, but still we had challenges at the other end. You know, as my colleague said, it's no more like before. You cannot just meet like before. So the change moved to online in most of the cases. The meetings moved to online meetings. At the same time, if we look at the factories, yes, we had an advantage, but the factories were not able to work at full capacity. Number one, because of curfews in the countries. Number two, because some of the employees were having already COVID. Number three, because the shifts, you know, they were not, even the employees that were allowed to work were not allowed to be available at the same time in the factory. So yes, we were having an advantage to ship, but the problem is that there was not enough manpower or capacity at the plants to give you the product that you needed. So there was pressure on the supply planning. You needed the product which you couldn't get. You had to find routes, and you were given preference by the government. So if you look at all the decrees that went that were given during the COVID, it was that we will, you know, all of the governments said we will not have disruption in pharmaceuticals, but you had to deal at the other side with active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is the raw material, which was not available. As my colleague said, most of the industries, they rely on their ingredients on China. We rely also on, all of these ingredients, they had challenge during that time. So mainly we had to cope with that challenge of lack of supply during to various reasons, despite that we were given advantage that many industries wished to have it at that time. What I can say here is we had during that period, or during this period, we had to move into more ownership. We had to give more ownership to the teams. Every team member had to make faster decisions, had to have more follow-ups. It's not like before, because when you go into details as management, you cannot manage all these details. We are having now to go into every shipment, and every product has different challenge. It's not like before. The supply of every product is coming from a different place. You're having different challenge which you have to deal with it. So you are obliged to give more delegation to the teams to decide, to be more aggressive in their follow-up, whether on getting the forecasts or whether on communicating with the suppliers. This is one thing which it was a learning point basically for us on new challenges, and on which I believe it benefited the teams in terms of responsibility.
Thank you for such an elaborate analysis. I think that is very important to put everything into perspective, because the challenges emerged. And as you see, what happened was that during the pandemic, it was very important to revise buy plans and allocate staff towards high demand categories, as you rightly said, refrain employees and deploy them to distribution centers in high demand areas, and allocate more transportation capacity to high demand items, relax same day, next day delivery if you are an e-commerce player. And I think mitigate this by listing orders in collaboration with supplier. And I think the challenges became enormous. Planning actually became difficult, and hence, because as Radha said earlier, that there was a huge change in the pack sizes, a huge change in consumer behavior, huge change in buying behavior, huge change in the channel which really cater to the consumer fulfillment. I think planning became single day, single week process, where one thing which became very clear was that the old deterministic approach would not work, the forecasting approach would not work, because you not only saw the market change due to the containment zones across the globe and in UAE, but also change because of the essential, not essential, and you saw the hyperlocal delivery units doing well to reach different markets, and everybody started collaborating differently, and they changed the game of planning and forecasting. And forecasting was at the backside, and everybody managed everyday demand in different localities. I think everyone was building a scenario which was just single day horizon rather than the long-term horizon. There could be a difference of opinion there, but I think the scenario for the long term in the pandemic period was lost. We collected a lot of data in during this period of time, and as we have collected a lot of data during this period of time, how useful is this data in terms of making decisions? So I'll start with Radharaman again.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite topic to discuss upon. People have been arguing that this data is not useful. This is very a kind of skew demand and all that. But I have a slight different opinion. I personally feel that this data is more informative, and I would just elaborate quickly why. Because if you see that consumer behavior have changed in last 3-4 years before this pandemic as well. The the real phenomenon of hyper consumerism, which is you go impulse buying, is no more valid from last 3 to 4 years. And now with this entire pandemic, your data is more reliable because that gives you, real demand signal, which tells you about your real customer. That's one point. Second point also to be noted that whenever all this situation happen, your core product, your core assortment never changes. So in this situation, you get to know about your core assortment. And if you see from the fashion industry, there is a need because of this and all fast fashion phenomenon, all this fashion industry have accumulated too many SKU, and now this is the right time to cut it and not trim it in a way that you really understand what is important and what is not. I will just add last 2 points and then I will just close this.
There's a question to that. Like, yes, maybe for beauty and fashion product, that's true. But there was a lot of demand which was, postponed. There was which will happen as a pent-up demand later. And people started buying SKUs, which made a lot of economic sense, right? So in that sense, it was not everything that one can rationalize it, I believe. There is a way to segment this data in a slightly broader way. Your way is correct, but a slightly broader way. What are your views on that?
Absolutely. And to be very frank, I 100% agree with what you said, because in this scenario, it could happen that consumer who would have bought product ABC would not buy now, but may buy after 1 to 2 months. So we don't know what that segment is. You have that small segment of that customer. So what we essentially do is, as I said, that data is not an issue. The issue is with the real information, and how you extract that information. And that is the reason, if you see all this fashion industry and these non-food retailer are investing heavily on this data analytics to really understand what is really making sense, what is not really making sense.
I'll come back to the data issue of the future data, but let me go back to Hannah on this. Hannah, how do you react to this? What has been the major challenges for the baseline forecast? What assumption changes that you made to make this, as a part of your monthly IBP or daily IBP, as you say, a weekly IBP?
I think the major importance about or the major challenge about to get the baseline is to understand what happened in the past. And this is one of the key challenge which face any company when they start to establish baseline. There are lots of techniques, either judgmental or statistical or artificial intelligence even, to generate baseline. But the key challenge is the history. And that's why it is very important, this data, that it's being understood and cleaned and used and built, actually. So you need to build your data warehouse, which means for the past at least minimum 2 years you need to be able to establish a baseline, the best baseline. So minimum 2 years, but of course if you don't have, you'll start with 6 months and then 1 year, and then you build it during the journey. Understanding
Anna,
the history.
how do you really clean this data for categories which have been postponed or not? You must have seen in some FMGGs that there are some categories which are future categories, but they have no data at all. There's no consumption. They've been lying down. There's been no production because there's no consumption. All the factories are so dynamically aligned, like an SNOP or IBP, that they've been producing what the market wanted in this 2 months. So how do you clean the data?
You mean in the epidemic or in general?
In epidemic. I was just talking about epidemic.
Okay. Yeah, okay. In the epidemic, it's not about baseline anymore. In the epidemic, it's more about the dynamics in the market. So we have to put the current status. For example, we have some customers, they are no longer have cash flow, they cannot buy anymore. We have some categories, they have been declined completely, like some snacking categories, people don't buy it anymore during the epidemic. because of their cash flow problems. So you need to understand what has been changed to your products and categories during this epidemic, and it's actually a complete different set of parameters as input now. So in addition to the price elasticity, which is very crucial in the current period, and it needs to be reviewed, and this is what happened actually. So the price sensitivity has been increased because of this epidemic, because of the money challenges or the cash flow challenges across the board. We have also VAT, which is happening, excise, which is impacting. Unfortunately, everything is happening at the same time. So it is very crucial to understand what impacted the demand by how much. So these new parameters or new demand drivers, we agreed on these are the new things, right? It's not the standard building blocks which we use all the time or the demand drivers anytime. So this is what we actually did. This is what we need to focus on. But baseline wouldn't be the most critical part in the epidemic at the moment. It's more about the factors which are changing now on ground and how to understand them as much as possible.
I think that's a good start to future, because understanding the factors which are more driving demand today, and as a first baseline, I think, as we said earlier, we can see that most businesses have been doing some scenario which are very, very short-term scenarios. It's single-day scenario. Long-term scenarios are missing in the whole approach. And some businesses have started doing it as a part of their integrated business planning or SNOP. How do you really plan for future? How do you see the role of the traditional baseline forecast in future as we move ahead from pandemic to unlockdown to normality in the long run? What should be the planning approach in this process? So let me get back to Jan. Jan, do you think the traditional forecasting would have a very strong role to play? Because if you see, whether it was Hana or it was Hassan, they talked about seasonality. But how do you build a planning approach which has this traditional forecasting if it's required, and also build a scenario in the past because of uncertainty which is going to be looming large?
I mean, for the timing, we think that for the past 3 months, we will basically bypass the data. I mean, for our product portfolio, because there have been too many different factors which completely disrupted our data. I mean, for instance, if we were online business, then we would have concrete data in terms of shifts. But right now, we don't see the real demand. I mean, there are too many things interfering in between that is harming the data quality that we have. And in any case, we are not direct to selling to end customer. I mean, we have too many intermediaries. And because of all this, the cash flow issues and commercial restrictions, and further the raw material supplies. So what is happening in terms of operation is completely different than the real demand. So, I mean, either we would have to do a complete history cleansing with too much effort, but for the time being, and most probably we will keep it simple, and this period we will just avoid with with the average of historical sales and try to shift back to our regular trends. Except we have seen some concrete shifts in various formats, like the hygiene products. I mean, these are completely new. This period's data is completely relevant for them because these sales have not been impacted. These we will keep it as it is, but for the others, mostly, and we will kind of clean up the historical data.
Yes.
It might be different from different sector to sector, but for us, that's the current approach.
Thank you, Jan. I think that's the right approach. Sandeep, you have been emphasizing on SNOP to a great extent. And if you look at the literature on SNOP or a practice on SNOP, the baseline forecast that goes into it is largely an aggregate forecast in a market with so many portfolios that you handle or all of you handle and SKUs that you handle, how are you going to use an aggregate forecast of all these with huge amount of variability, both bias and error, into planning processes? I think SNOP somewhere has lost out because it builds in a very strong aggregate forecast into it. And believe me, unlike what Radha says, in most companies we find very different approaches. The aggregate forecast is more accurate because it signals out the minus and then a plus, and the disaggregate forecast can be dangerous, cannot be visible. You would be scared to watch the magnitude of error and magnitude of biases that really are seen there. So how are you going to use SNOP in such a situation?
Well, totally depends on what kind of product and industry you're applying SNOP and how stable the demand is. So SNOP, when you talk about SNOP, it's a process, but that doesn't take away the fact that the tools and the different forecasting parameters and the different digital supply network options that we have in today's world with AI, ML coming in. So so SNOP is revolved more of a process. The demand planning traditionally is being done on a linear model, which is not probably relevant, taking into consideration the kind of data and the data points that we are receiving and the access we have to such options in today's digital supply chain networks. So so it is interesting how we can collaborate these different data points and different techniques and use the demand sensing to make real-time decisions and cut across different silos and collaborate better with our partners, customers, and suppliers, and even the supplier. So here again, data becomes very relevant. So one is visibility, velocity, and variability. So with the increasing visibility and the velocity, we will be able to bring down the variability in the data and help us plan better and take better decisions in real time and plan on the go rather than just depending on aggregate modeling.
Sandeep, this has been a very oft-repeated argument of the past that when you started with this APOs or ERP, this was the argument given. But we did not have that kind of a impact on variability and as well as visibility or velocity. And what we find is that most businesses across the globe, if you look at the case studies available at Harvard Business School on them, says that the standard deviation is so and mean is so, and then your safety stock is so, despite your investment into systems and APOs. So I think we need to go a little beyond this oft-repeated lament of visibility, velocity, and lean and all those things. We need to see that how do we really do this, and that's a big challenge. I think Hannah and Radha said ML and AI can be very helpful, but ML and AI, are they tools which can really create future data? Are there tools that are based on the data of the immediate past or the past? They have huge big data, but they can only get insight into when the system, the whole, the market remains stable. Instability of a market would throw them open to the same, verification that how do you cleanse data? How do you make data relevant to the market changes that are happening?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when you talk about all these options, yeah,
Sandeep,
yeah, I think so.
Radha,
Radha is more into analytics. Probably he can, give a better perspective on that. Passion and perspective.
Yeah, so yes, I do agree partially with you, Dr. Rakesh, on this, saying that you have such a variability and uncertainty, and then we are talking about this AI ML. Will this really help? The answer is very simple. Let's say that, okay, for argument's sake, that we don't have AI ML, right? So what we have historical data, and we have factors, which is the most important thing. So what a normal planner does, he basically checks all these factors and then try to see that what would be the influence of this factor in the forecast. And see, when we have more uncertainty, you have more factor involved. And when you have more factor, a normal human being, normal traditional algorithm, or traditional process doesn't give you any kind of real input. Why this machine learning will help is whatever a normal human being will learn from this all this factor historical thing, the same thing would be done by this algorithm. So you will have more factor involved, more uncertainty involved, which a normal person would probably miss out. And that is the reason I have personally seen real advantage. And this is a kind of normal thing. If you don't see something, you always start speculating that this is just a kind of fancy word. Having said that, this is very, very important that your data is clean, which you have rightly pointed out, that if your data is not clean, doesn't matter which algorithm, AI, ML, supercomputer, whatever you use, you will not be able to do that. So yes, data is key. And second,
there is an advantage beyond what you're saying, is that the big data essentially has a capabilities and ability to interpret build its own hypothesis given the kind of the data. It also has ability to create outliers in the data if you have long-term data, and maybe it also has the ability to incorporate some insight into the whole data. Now getting into the next question to Hannah. Hannah, I think IBP is an amazing approach. It has been, more fundamental to the design of an organization in terms of cultural change and organizational integration with the business strategy and larger business planning. What should be the approach in planning which moves from now onwards in the long run, and how IBP approach can incorporate the short run into the long run, and what should be the mechanism to do that?
That's a very interesting question, and actually it is faced every day, not only during the epidemic. So being out of the epidemic somehow, we start to move, where the business start to open and the economy start to refresh now. Looking into the long term, let's say, for example, next year plans. What we should do actually, and this is what we started to do as well in the current months, is try to understand what the epidemic impacted our demand signal and our sales and our revenue. Try to look also at last year. So it depends on the category again, or the brand. Either we look at the last year and make the analysis versus last year directly, so 21 versus 19, or try to clean the impact in 20. And after you clean the impact of 20, you do put the projections for 2021 in regard to growth percentages and so on. So this is how you either look at it from last year or from this year perspective. Regarding short term into long term, this is a continuous improvement, and as I mentioned earlier, this demand control process or execution process, short-term execution process, which is the next 3 months, what actually should be done is it should be updated and automatically reflected into the IBP process. So when we set in the IBP forums, we should not be discussing again the short term. Looking into the short term, definitely eat the meeting. Make the decisions more weaker and more not effective. That's why it is very crucial to just embed directly what we have decided in the short term into the IBP and enforce the IBP to really discuss long term, because this is where we put all the strategic decisions, the capacity exercises, and all the large financial decisions on the table, and it enables us to grow. IBP is enabler to any company to be able to take decisions and grow. If we always look at the short term in the IBP, then we will never be able to accomplish this. So this is the key, 2 key messages I would like to give about this point.
Thank you, Hannah. I think that's a very well summarized. As we are running out of time, that would have been my last query from the panel. But taking forward what Hannah said, it is very important for us to ensure that short term is not the enemy of long term in supply chain planning. And I think most often we tend not to relate the short term to the long term. We say in long term, you're all dead. But as everyone said, building up scenarios in the long run, identifying risk and building up a resilient framework is important. Also saw that reboot new products, new channels, and new supply chain strategy which may emerge post-pandemic. As Hassan brought about the workplace dynamics, the human angle of the supply chain planning, and also as others brought about channel that are going to change, and the way it will determine, and the global channel and the global economy needs to be a part of your strategy, and practice truth as we know it. This is not the time to judge. Live with the impact of this season. I'm quoting from an article on our SCM Pro knowledge. This thing, I think, this is a very strong summary of planning how and what direction it takes. Now we have some question answers from the participants. Now it's a question answer time. The first question that we have is for Mr. Jha. In multiple scenario, planning approach is suitable for robust SNOP process. Are we supposed to follow just if case supply model, but this may lead to increase in inventory levels? From Mohit Upadhyay. Radha,
Yes, yeah.
do
So
you get
yes,
the
I
question?
agree that. Sorry, go on, please.
You get the question.
Yeah. So I think the question is that even this multiple scenario would eventually end up having a higher inventory level, and how you would deal with that. That's the question. And I totally agree with him. And this is this is where the real challenge is. I know this is where the real human demand planning factor come in picture, because again, system is system algorithm, anything is just a kind of idiot box. It will give you some kind of input and the output, but it's on you that how you take it up, and how you put human element of your demand planning into it. Just to give a kind of simple example from the e-com industry, right? So let's say if you start giving a kind of 2-hour delivery to all your customer, your demand will go up, right? So these kind of demand signal are not captured anywhere, and you have to be have all these human element to counter this, and use this effectively to ensure that you don't inflate your inventory level. I hope I answer his question.
The second question goes to Dr. Hana. For organizations which have higher number of SKUs, let's say 1,000 plus, isn't it better to focus on core range 80 to 20 rule with right information flows between stakeholders, and let the rest of SKUs driven by statistical forecast with periodic review? What is your take and suggestion?
Of course, and actually this is one of the key messages we give when we discuss IBP, and that is what's actually happening. So we focus on the key top categories or brands. Actually, as we discussed before, IBP is not by SKU. So IBP is usually by family group, which is more categorized way. We don't look at SKU level. However, automatically the system should be disaggregating based on historical sales or based on some inputs we know about these SKUs. So these are the focus areas, not only the 80-20, but another key aspect, which is the biasness in these categories or in these family groups. So we should be looking at which family groups which have a complete bias for the past 3 months or 6 months, continuous bias, which means we are not able to forecast them rightly, and focus on them so that we correct the forecast in the future. So these are the two aspects of which families we should focus on when we discuss in the IBP.
All right, thank you, Anna. The next one goes to John. Does the short-term daily or weekly SOP meeting really help in entering the production planning, or will that only give a direction for us to sow demand shaping activity to ensure optimal inventory and avoid OOS? Please throw some light on it, from Gino Mohammed.
I mean, basically what we do for short term definitely cannot impact production very fast, because most of the time the lead times are, let's say, 2-3 months in general. And therefore, the impact on production side will come after some time. But still, whatever happens, I mean, sometimes it's not only small changes. Nowadays, we might have drastic changes on a daily basis. In that case, I mean, we can immediately give a signal to the production side and for the raw and material planners to make the changes. So any info that is received is immediately transferred to all the respective people.
All right, thank you, Jan. I think it is a DDMRP based question where you get the demand from the market and from your distributor or from your POS data. It comes to the various decoupling point, which are compressed lead time as compared to any simple MRP, which has a very long lead time of manufacturing or consumer lead time or cumulative lead time. And hence they say that as you have different inventories at different level which are decoupled, then there is a flow of inventory, and hence you don't have stockouts, and your customer service is much higher than in the normal sense, and there is a better management of inventory, though it's more than in the forecasting based approaches or SNOP and IBP based approaches, but it is higher and the trade-off is much better. So that's the question that was. There is a question from Mr. Periyasamy. Would like to understand more ML AI taking over on deciding planning strategy autonomously in near future and its impact. Some simple live example which will help, from Periyasamy. Anyone who wants to take this? Anna, you want to take this?
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
okay.
No, go on,
Yeah,
Hannah,
Radha,
please.
go ahead.
Okay, so yes, I mean, again, as I said that, I this, generally I said that customer is king and data is queen. So you have to ensure that, king and queen both are happy. Then only will do a real demand planning. Just to give a simple example of machine learning and, how it really helps. As I said in my, previous example, that there are many factors which influences your demand forecasting apart from just merely historical. So history is just one part of your entire demand forecasting, and when you have all these different variables, you can only learn from these different variable their impact, and then you apply it. And that's when your all this come. A simple example of ARIMA model, right? So normal regression model takes into account only your historical sales, sales, season, event, and so on. But when you have such a kind of machine learning based ARIMA model, it takes into account all your factors, saying that okay, whenever this factor will happen in this period of time, in this week, this have been the impact apart from seasonality, event, all this holiday effect, weekend effect, and so on. So when you have all these things, then it will come in picture. Yes, to answer your question about future of demand forecasting, you have to understand that future of demand forecasting is not demand forecasting. The future of demand forecasting is the predictive analytics. So demand forecasting is just one subset of your predictive analytics. So
all right, thank you, Radha. Let me go back to Hannah on this. Do you agree with what Radha is saying, Hannah?
Yeah, definitely, I agree with him. But I would like to add up also a couple of points. So you use AI when you have different parameters and different questions with many dynamics. For example, you need to understand the consumer behavior, which is used largely in the AI is used largely in that. You need to understand the consumption analysis. So it is used when you have large database and huge number of data points, and you need to ask and answer a couple of questions. So you need multiple dynamic model, which is enabled by AI. AI doesn't use only one statistical model. You can use different statistical models for different time series types. So this is where the AI practically used in the business.
Excuse me, if you allow me here to add
yes,
something.
No problem. Please.
Yeah, we are talking about AI now, as if it is something that's tangible in terms of supply chain and planning. Um, I don't see that we have to. I do not recommend that we mix the current planning tools that we have with AI, because AI applications are still very primitive. We are still in the early phases of AI, and I believe the developers, or what we have seen till now, they are very limited to key industries, especially in defense and governmental sectors. It is too early to apply AI to supply chain at this time. If we are talking about genuine AI, where the system or the application will start taking historical data and assume probabilities on its own and give you the recommendations. This is, I don't see it happening in the coming 5 to 10 years in the supply chain industry. So what I would do suggest that people continue building, or supply chain people continue working on the current models that they have, current capabilities that they have, and leave the this what do you say, this high expectation of AI that it's gonna solve the supply challenges. It's not gonna solve it in the short term. Definitely, we are not a priority for the AI developers or the AI industry. What I really recommend is that to continue as we are, work with the tools that we have, and use the personal judgment more. What we have experienced now, experience counts a lot at this point. Use our experience.
I think you have driven home your point very well. There could be a lot of disagreement on this, as what you have said, both on your AI approach and on your gut feeling that, or experience that you are talking about. Though 90% of the forecasting across the globe is gut feeling. We have everything in place, but as you rightly said, it becomes gut feeling at the end of the day when you have your SNOP meetings happen. If they're not very well orchestrated, they can turn into a very firefighting data or targets that can happen. There's one question for you before we close, and what do you see as biggest threat or challenge currently for supply planners of medical devices or healthcare industries, and how their approach should be on the forecast and inventories? I think you answered that with AI, but I think you can go ahead.
Yeah. The biggest challenge now, what I see is that, first of all, guys, focus on not closing your business. Let your business continue running. We are seeing hundreds and thousands of companies shutting down. So let us focus on the bigger picture. Look at what makes your company survive. Align very well with your finance teams, with your management. Make sure that you focus on the bigger picture. How to reduce your costs, and how to work on your big profit makers in your inventory. Work on that. Let this phase pass safely, and then go back to whatever you want to do later on. But I really recommend now that you overcome this phase, put hard work to make sure that you don't miss the bigger picture and you stay in business. This is my advice.
Thank you, Hassan, and I think we have really run out of time. So let me thank all of you and summarize the key points that we really need to look at it. And as I said, everything in planning supply chain should be a part of the long-term planning. One big question that came up with 3 good inputs that we have had from Hassan, Radha Raman, and Hannah is that AI and ML. I think that is also the future, despite having skepticism about it. the first fundamental challenge that we face is that how do you use sensors, how do you use automation, how do you use analytics in order to make your supply chain visible, as Sandeep said earlier. And I think autonomous planning or connected planning would go a big way in terms of bringing the right kind of technology with insights from ML, AL, and backing from sensors collecting data and blockchain which provides security. This autonomous planning will integrate your supplier, as Hassan rightly said. Securing your supply when there are so many tiers of it, you don't know whether you will have the basic supplies today or not. Securing that whatever is demanded in the marketplace when you go for autonomous planning is produced in the factories, securing that you have the right trucks and the right warehouses available. And as you have seen in the pandemic that we have gone hyper local, we have gone into smaller markets where we never thought of having a warehouses, we needed warehouses, we were not able to secure warehouses. I think visibility is going to be an amazing factor which brings in huge amount of agility, and also create a very automatic or e-routing systems where network costs can be reduced, and it also brings in a huge dynamics for sharing your trucks, sharing your facilities, and having horizontal and vertical integration in a big way. I think the future definitely is ML AI providing the basic analytics in this thing. But at the end, SNOP and IBP will remain as a very strong thing. One thing good about moving to IBP as a larger, which is based on the strategic business plan, is that it is a very fundamentally sound thing. It does have some drawbacks, but I would say a demand review based on portfolio review, complemented by a supply chain review, then you preserve cash through and manage cash through financial reconciliation. It goes to the top management as a management reconciliation. It comes as a particular well-defined plan where the governance plays a very important. You cannot change the plan unless you have sufficient discussion on that, can really help. And if there is a visibility, all these planning baseline forecasts can be dynamically changed every day, making scenarios much better, and any futuristic long-term horizons can be the guiding factor for short-term horizons. So I think we are seeing a change towards autonomous planning. Periswamy, I'm also answering your question. And I thank Dr. Hana Goma, Jan Kavli, Hassan Jamaluddin, Radha Raman Jha, and Sandeep Karkera. And I invite Jaisal to say the formal vote of thanks. Thank you very much.